Good afternoon, evening, good morning, everyone, wherever you are in the world today. And as we were saying just before we started recording, it's difficult to find one region in the world today that isn't under some kind of severe stress. So we're going to try and cover as much as we can. Of course, as I said, there are multiple zones that are kind of under attack of one kind or another. Sorry, the cat was just interrupting. So I think we'll get started pretty quickly. We'll give you too much of a preamble because I'll be here all night otherwise. Fee, I wanted to really start with you being in Latin America at the moment. What is basically your summary of what's going on in Cuba? There's been promises of Russia sending an oil tanker. We're still kind of, I assume, waiting for that to actually happen. Meanwhile, there are reports that actually Russia is not going to go out on a limb to protect oil tanker deliveries into Cuba to relieve the siege and blockade that they're now under. That was, of course, put in place by Trump. Because, as we've been saying, the chances of either China or Russia entering into what would be effectively a military conflict in the United States backyard is highly unlikely. So I think beyond the rhetoric, we're not actually going to see much action from either state to actually step in and do something concrete to relieve the pressure on Cuba. But we also heard today a story very late in the afternoon, I think, about the killing of a head of one of the biggest drug cartels in Mexico. So I'd like to get your take on that and just your take generally on where we're heading in Latin America.
Yeah, so that's so much to unpack there.
Yeah.
Let's go from north to south. So let's go from North America in terms of Mexico. I find it interesting that one of the world's most, I guess, infamous drug traffickers, the Mexican cartel boss, he was known as El Mencho. He was essentially killed by the security forces. There was attacks at the airport. If everybody saw the explosions, it was this massive thing, and it kicked off so much like violence. There were cars that were lit on fire, and it's just this whole thing that happened. And the thing is, like, we know that cartels are a thing in Mexico. We know that it is a problem that the Mexican government, both the current one and AMLO's, Manuel López Obrador, who was the president before Claudia Sheinbaum, they've had to deal with it. And I was recently in Mexico in late December, and there seems to have been an improvement in Mexico since the last time I was there. There was less, I saw less poverty. I saw more of support for the government. And I think that's just an extension of like the work Mexico has done as a whole. It's not like there wasn't any poverty or that there weren't situations where things were 100% normal or safe, but I did feel actually safer in Mexico than a lot of people are told. I feel in the United States every time I go back. And it's important to talk about that in the context of how the United States, especially the Trump administration, have consistently accused Mexico of being the ones that are the problem in terms of the drug cartels. We know the United States has participated in the so-called war on drugs. We know that the biggest cartel in the entire world is the DEA, that has really manipulated the transport of weapons throughout Central America and into South America as well. And this is, of course, what was used to accuse Nicolas Maduro of being a narco drug trafficker. The fact that Nicolas Maduro was then smuggling drugs through Venezuela, and this has been the accusation. So when this happened, and I saw that this whole thing with this infamous drug lord is happening in the background of everything the United States is doing to Latin America, I find that really, really suspect. just on the timing of everything and on the fact that the entirety of the media has harped on this story as the number one story in the last few days. And I have heard nothing except this. I mean, it's just been, oh, look, there was this cartel boss that was killed, blah, blah, blah. It kind of reinforces the Trump administration's view of, you know, of these drug traffickers and terrorists coming through the border. It reinforces the Trump administration's view of the immigration issue and how it must be stopped and how the drug issue must be stopped. And now, you know, it's I find it really odd and like how this just happened so quickly. Simultaneously, we know that the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has been adamant about sending aid to Cuba and has kind of posed a lot of resistance to Trump. Like, you know, she refused to have U.S. troops go into Mexico. She refused to really allow Trump to dictate the terms, the United States, right, to dictate these terms of how things are going to happen in Mexico. She has gone and said a lot of things vocally and has actually done things. I think one of the only bits of substantial aid that Cuba has received has come from Mexico. So I do find it very interesting in that context for that reason. And then in those terms, I think we can also talk about how right now the situation is dire for Cuba because they are still waiting for this oil that's supposedly coming from Russia. And again, I have seen Russian media and even Russian spokespeople say that yes, that there's supposed to be some oil to Cuba, but there's also the reality that the United States has seized several tankers. The United States has seized Russian ships and has received very little backlash from Russia, other than, you know, the whole diplomatic, oh yes, we're working with the United States. I think they did release the Russian, one of the Russian captives that they had, but we really haven't seen a lot of like backlash from Russia. We've seen a lot of just constant diplomatic talk in terms of the United States. And I know that's also because Russia is currently engaged in trying to have some sort of negotiations with the United States. But before I go into the Russia stuff, I do want to say that I see what is happening in Latin America as a full-on takeover by a very, very far right Zionist supremacist type of structure that is heavily focused on a competition for resources. And really quickly, in those terms, where Venezuela is now pretty much working with the United States, where now Venezuelan anti-government, anti-Maduro forces that were held imprisoned are being released and are allowed to come back. It really creates a situation where, yes, the Chavistas are in power, but we know that the United States is holding the gun to their head. And we know that Cuba has been extremely dependent on that. And we know that then we have upcoming elections in Peru, in Colombia, in Brazil. Major key points for South America. We're talking about Peru in the lithium triangle, having access to these minerals that are essential for both China and the United States in the AI tech surveillance race that we're seeing. We're talking about Colombia, who was the only NATO partner, and Petro, who has provided some pushback against Trump, and who has, at the very least, in spite of some of the dumb statements he's made against Venezuela, has at the very least opened up that diplomacy that didn't exist before, has at the very least talked about U.S. intervention and South American unity and bringing that back, and has really kind of pushed back on a lot of the things that a lot of people thought he wouldn't push back on. And then we have Lula da Silva, who very much like Gustavo Petro has improved the situation in Brazil in terms of, you know, how many eggs people have in their fridge and how much chicken people have. That's why people voted for him. in terms of the economic issues. And because Brazil was really in a dire situation under Bolsonaro. And there has been some improvement. But again, Lula is also that character that is wishy-washy in a lot of other terms in foreign policy, in terms of his liberalism, with a lot of the technocratic stuff, same as in Mexico and in Colombia we've seen as well. But, if these elections, if Trump and the US get their way and put a Bukele figure or a Malay, as we have been seeing the vast protests in Argentina, if he gets his way and if the United States has a major influence to take South America to the far right, I think we're going to see the total entire capture of South America's resources, the total capture of the natural breathing lungs of the Amazon, which has for a long time been the goal of the West. And I think it's gonna be an era of a Pinochet-like institutional power in Latin America, and that is a very, very strong possibility. So when we're looking at China or Russia, are they going to get involved? The only way they would get involved, especially China, who has the capacity to get involved, and they are involved, is in their capacity to invest and compete with China for these resources. And I could talk a little bit more about Peru specifically, but that is an extremely important point to make. It's not even about China wanting to help Latin America. It's about the competition for these resources that are so important for what's to come.
Yeah, but to a degree, I mean, I'd like to know your opinion, because when we're talking about Latin America coming very much back under the control or into the sphere of influence of the United States, then to what degree are they going to be able to control or manipulate external investment, whether it's China or Russia? But as you say, it's more likely to be China, or to squeeze it out of the picture. If we're talking rare earth minerals, there's potential that they're going to have to go into collaboration of some degree with China, because they don't have currently the mining and the processing and the extraction capabilities. And, that's why China has basically a monopoly on I don't know, around 90% of the world's rare earth mineral market, which is that's without even going into the ecological, environmental catastrophe that comes as a result of rare earth mineral processing in whatever country. And it's pretty much in every country of the world. I can't remember who I watched the other day. I think it might have been James Corbett, who was saying, yeah, but they're not rare. They're like everywhere in the world, actually. What is rare is the capability or the capacity to extract and then process them. And at the moment, that's really China that has the monopoly. So there might be some degree of leniency from the US from that perspective. But to what degree do you think, if the future comes to realization as you see it, to what degree do you think the US is going to open the door for China to come in and actually participate in investment and marketeering in the countries that are effectively back under the US sphere of influence?
Yeah, I think they are going to have to. In terms of what you said, China has the largest monopoly. China, we're all facing, and we can talk about this further, the world is facing a gigantic global depression economically. I mean, there's inflation everywhere. There's a lot of instability right now economically. But the reality is, out of everybody, in spite of the fact that China's may not be as perfect as others, as everybody thinks, I think the United States' economy is going downhill. And that doesn't mean, of course, that the elites are not, right? That the people in power are not. But I will say, in those terms, and in the terms of what the United States has done foreign policy wise, it's been actually very much taken into account in places like Peru, for example, where there has been a movement towards working with a favorable movement towards working with the Chinese rather than the Americans. The Americans are looked on as being extremely just unfair. We've talked about this, a very I win, you lose situation versus like the Chinese, like, oh, we'll give you something, but we'll take something too. I mean, it's a different type of diplomacy, at least up front. The reality is that for example, in Peru, the mining and the rare earth minerals have for a long time not really been handled by the country. I mean, they've been handled by the people who live there and who work there, particularly in rural regions. But the money has always gone elsewhere. It has gone outside of the country. This is why one of the reasons why Pedro Castillo, who is now in prison, was actually a threat, because he did talk about how they wanted to keep the riches in Peru rather than have them exported by big multinational corporations. The problem is those big multinational corporations are no longer just US corporations. You have Chinese investments, Chinese supermarkets, the Chinese corporate sector. So in a way, what you're saying is, like it's like territorial. It's like almost cartels. You have the US and the Chinese cartel. And I'm not trying to just, be evil about this or insult, China, but that's how it's operating like this. Like, because they have their interests and the US have their interests, and they're both existing in places like Peru that are, what Americans call a third world country, and what really shouldn't be because of the amount of resources they have. But now what's happened is the Chinese have built the Shanghai port, and this Shanghai port is a major thing that a lot of people are not paying attention to, because it's basically this deep water port that makes it so easy for ships to go to China that way from Peru instead of going all the way around the world to get there. It cuts down the time substantially, and it was inaugurated on November 2024, and ever since then it's been just a huge factor for China's Belt and Road Initiative. This is something that they want to do, and it's basically cut down the shipping supply days to 23 days, which makes it so much easier for them. So they're getting all of these resources, they're getting all of this, economic flow. And the whole aim of China's Belt and Road Initiative, the whole goal is to make Peru like the Singapore of Latin America, to make specifically Lima that Singapore of Latin America. And so when you look at that way, you can see that this is a long-term thing. This isn't like, oh, we're just going to stay here for now. This is like a huge goal that they have. And one of the recent things that's happened is the United States has changed the Peruvian ambassador to the US, and they have placed somebody that is, he's Puerto Rican citizenship or American citizenship, but he was descendant of Cubans. So he's like a Cuban guy who lived in Puerto Rico, who has a Peruvian wife, and he is the new Peruvian ambassador to the US. And he is extremely Trump affiliated. And they're trying to convince the Peruvians to sway towards the United States, because they're trying to essentially influence them to move and work in favor with the United States. So there has been a long time manipulation here towards getting the people here to move away from China. But ultimately, I think what we're going to see is the existence of both in a tug of war, where these resources are just fought out over. And that's going to be not just here, but pretty much, I think, everywhere else. But that port, specifically the port of Shanghai, does make it, does give China the upper hand this. And again, it's you're absolutely right. It's not about the fact that these are so rare, but it's also it's about the fact that this gigantic port is there, and so now China has the upper hand, and who's working for these companies, right? It's Peruvians, but a lot of this money is being outsourced outside. So in the end, what we're seeing is still, whether it's China or the United States, the money doesn't stay in the country. Like Peru.
Yeah. And I mean, you're right. I was reading something quite recently about how the Chinese settled into Latin America and then built their supermarkets and created an entire kind of, it is a cartel, basically. I think also in Argentina and in Venezuela and in a number of other countries in Latin America. So yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually, is, America is going to have to deal with that to a large degree and to come to some kind of compromise. I'm guessing. It's fascinating what's going on there, and I think to a degree, it reflects what, as we've said before, what's going on in this region in West Asia. Obviously, we still seem to be on track for some kind of war with Iran. I'm still not entirely convinced that we're heading straight for a kinetic war, each one bombing the other and so on. My feeling is if we do head in that direction, I think, first of all, they're trying to get certain elements in place that will further weaken Iran on its borders, internally, and have the two things running in parallel. Because I think Trump knows, and I certainly think the Pentagon knows, that if they do go for a kinetic war, then they are going to get severely damaged. I mean, yeah, you have someone like Lindsey Graham saying, well, who cares, basically, that's what our soldiers are there for. They should die for the cause and so on. As I said, we'll tell him to go and stand on the roof of one of the bases in Qatar or Iraq or wherever, right? Because I think what is interesting is today the US is withdrawing, I think, around 40 members of its staff from the US embassy here, which, is the equivalent of the Green Zone in Baghdad in Iraq. The Iraqi forces have already kind of evacuated into Iraqi Kurdistan. Now, the Syrian forces, and this is interesting because it's not really being done with an official statement from either CENTCOM or the White House, but there are multiple videos of troop withdrawal from inside Syria, not only from the northeast to Iraqi Kurdistan, so very much to the same area, which of course is dangerously close to Iranian borders, but also from Al Tanf, really the primary US military base on the border with Iraq and Jordan. Allegedly, reportedly, they're also withdrawing from there. And of course, this comes in parallel or in addition to the green light from Washington for Jolani or Ahmed al-Sharaa, however you want to describe him, he's still Al-Qaeda / ISIS, to effectively push the Kurds into a very small corner of the northeast of Syria near a place called Hasaka, close to the border with Iraq, and to effectively release numbers vary between 15,000 to 20,000 ISIS fighters and radicalized teenagers, children. I've written about this quite recently. The MI6 and the British regime funding of the holding camps for ISIS in northeast Syria and the further radicalization, particularly of children in those camps. So to basically indoctrinate them with the ISIS fanatic ideology. And we're now seeing a number of attacks being carried out by ISIS against Jolani militia in pretty much all areas of Syria, and they have issued a statement saying that they are going to be conducting kind of a world campaign to a degree. Now, all of this is going to impact on Iran and on Iran's northern and western borders, because I was actually looking into the populations, if you combine them, of the Kurdish areas in Iran, which the majority happen to be on that western border, which will then join with Iraqi Kurdistan. Then you have Turkish Kurdistan and Syria Kurdistan, basically. There's around, numbers vary, but let's say around 40 million Kurds in those areas combined. Yeah, I was pretty mind blown by that, right? Yeah. And now, recently in Iran, there's, I think, 5 Kurdish separatist factions who formed an alliance called the Alliance of Political Forces of Iranian Kurdistan, who have as one of their campaign missions to overthrow the Iranian government. So you have this entire arc of kind of artificially created Kurdistan sectors in all of these countries that could potentially be mobilized, combined with the MAK terrorists who, of course, are embedded in Iraqi Kurdistan. The IRGC is, there have been videos circulating of IRGC convoys heading to the border with Iraq. So obviously they've, they're aware of the issue, but it's the sheer numbers that kind of is concerning to me, because if you combine, I'm not saying the Kurds and ISIS are going to fight alongside each other, but you have a dual threat. Because if we go back to Greater Israel, even after Greater Israel, the map of Colonel Ralph Peters, which was drawn in 2006, he talks about the creation of a Sunni state in Iraq, basically bordering Syria. So what it does is it extends that Takfiri element from Syria into Iraq with a potential to arrive basically at the Iranian border and then link up with the Takfiri elements that do exist in the Balochistan region in Iran. And then also that links up with potential Pakistani Takfiri factions that are known to have been carrying out terrorist attacks against Iran for some time. And that's without taking into account the destabilization that's been ongoing in Pakistan with the imprisonment of Imran, the overthrow and imprisonment of Imran Khan. And while Pakistan is kind of at the moment doing a Turkey and kind of appearing to be the friend of everyone, including Saudi Arabia and Iran, and it's making statements about, there shouldn't be an aggression against Iran, but I'm not so sure in the long run that they're not going to come in on the side of Israel and Washington. At the same time, J.D. Vance was in Baku, Azerbaijan. I think, when was it? On the 10th and 11th of February. And of course, they're establishing the American managed Zangezur corridor, which directly threatens the northern border of Iran, but also the South Caucasus, so the southern border of Russia. So it's a dual threat, in my opinion. From Azerbaijan, and with Israeli surveillance coming in, of course. So that means drones and air surveillance over Iranian territory, potentially. And over Russian territory, we can't rule that out. And of course, it dissects the traditional route for the north-south trade corridor, which is why we know Russia has been making overtures to Afghanistan to try and reroute if necessary. Mm-hmm. But effectively, Azerbaijan is coming on board as another military outpost for the US and Israel directly on Iran's borders. And then you now have the deal allegedly between Trump and Turkey and Erdogan, to effectively exclude Russia from energy supply to Europe, because in theory, Erdogan, with plenty of incentives from Trump, is going to lift the prohibitions on the Bosphorus Straits and allow LNG gas in from America. So then you've got the corridor from Ukraine, Turkey to Europe with US dominance. So there's a ton of maneuvering going on. And I just want to finish with what I thought was kind of an eerie speech from Netanyahu, and I'd like to get your opinion on it as well, where he talks about creating this hexagon of alliances. And he talks about that including African countries, European countries, which are, of course, predominantly Greece and Cyprus, which are new acquisitions really for Israel from an influence perspective. Gulf states, predominantly UAE, which is effectively nothing more than a vassal state of Israel, the Zionist movement, and Washington and the entire Zionist bloc. And of course, UAE is again positioned really as a threat, as a launching pad against Iran. There's multiple, I think it was the Iranian hacking group Handala that put out an infograph showing the number of Zionist entities that have established organizations and industry and infrastructure inside UAE. So if a war does kick off, of course, UAE would also be kind of a number one target for Iranian missiles if it's going to be targeting all members of the Zionist alliance in the region, which include, of course, Washington's bases, although they are consolidating in Iraqi Kurdistan. Again, interesting. So everything is in preparation. It's not only about the number of war jets that are being brought in, or the arguments over Diego Garcia between Starmer and Trump, or which I think is, I wouldn't say it's for show, but I think Starmer's probably holding out for some concessions from Trump on something or other. It could be on Ukraine. And then, so it's not only the military buildup. In fact, what I think is more important is all the buildup in the countries surrounding Iran. And then that's even without Turkmenistan, which we know that many of the fighters under Jolani's command came from Turkmenistan. Right. So, and I always go back to this interview that Jolani gave in 2015 when he talked about cutting the hands of the resistance, leaving what he considered to be the head of the resistance, which is Iran. And he said, but then we will have millions of Takfiri on the borders of Iran, inside Iran. And this, we have to remember it's not Jolani speaking, so I'm certainly not supporting his statement, but this is a clear strategy. And for me, what I see happening on the ground, this strategy is now being rolled out. And the fact that the US is withdrawing from that corridor where potentially the Takfiris could threaten Iranian borders is very telling for me. And the fact that they're also removing embassy staff from here in Lebanon. And there has been an escalation in the last few days. They killed another, I think, 8 members of Hezbollah leadership in the strikes in Bekaa. So, we're heading in one way or another, whether it's going to be a major aggression or whether they're going to drag out this kind of slow buildup of forces against Iran in order that when that kinetic strike comes, they can also divert and distract Iranian forces to multiple fronts, which is a typical strategy. I mean, that I'm not a military expert, but that would make more sense than a simple strike, which is going to be retaliated against by Iran and is going to cause huge damage in Israel and in the region to US military bases.
Wow, it's like there's so much. It's quite depressing, I have to say. What I see happening, and I fully agree with your perspective. It does seem like they're, and this has been happening for a long time. I mean, the released ISIS prisoners That's happened months ago. You mentioned that, we talked about it, and now this has expanded. Some would say death by 1,000 cuts, right? An attempt to surround Iran in a fight of multiple fronts, and no one can survive a fight in multiple fronts. But the thing that I think has irritated me is the continued push that there's some sort of unity between China and Russia with Iran, that they're going to step in and defend. I honestly think that this is, yes, their sphere of influence. There's more of an interest. Iran is a different player on the board. Absolutely. I understand that, but I also understand what's actually happening in the background is the potential negotiations for between Russia and the United States, right, over Ukraine. There's Russia's desire for economic expansion and capital gain, and there's also the Chinese, I guess, obsession and desire and hyper focus on the global market, on its expansion into the global market, on its trade, on its tech and AI development, because China is actually leading on that, which is not, as others have said, like, it's so great. It's just, where we're headed, there's not really any major power that's not embraced the AI tech surveillance stuff. I've been to these countries except China, but I mean, they're the ones that are amplifying it to a great deal. The United States isn't even able to compete with that at this point. And that's not necessarily, I mean, nothing about this world that we're, moving towards is good. And we've seen Trump's Board of Peace really highlight that that's what's going to happen with Gaza, that is what is happening with Gaza, this technocratic prison. That's going to be, of course, a sample project for the rest of the world. And my question, Vanessa, is along the lines of China and Russia, and also along the lines of, like, is Iran going to fight back? Because the other, or what that constitutes, because the other thing I've seen on social media is, Iran is going to respond as soon as the United States does something. As soon as the United States touches a hair on anybody, Iran's going to respond, that they've learned from the 12-day war, which I think that there has been obviously a learning curve from that. But that's not to say that I haven't seen, and we've talked about this before, the divide between the liberal wing in Iran, and then, the Imam and the IRGC, like, and the resistance as a whole. I just, based on everything I'm seeing, I'm hesitant to think that what you said isn't a possibility. In other words, I think that it is very possible for there to be some sort of diplomatic deal to stop something from happening, in spite of the fact that the United States and Israel do want to attack. And I think that they have put in all the mechanisms for an attack. But I also think that they would prefer something much less catastrophic for their own interests. They don't want the damage, right? And I am just not convinced that we're going to see this gigantic big war that a lot of people have been saying, it's happening this weekend, it's happening this weekend, it's happening the next weekend. It's been like a long time. And I'm not demanding that there is a war, but what I would like to see actually is for an actual direct opposition. I feel like the United States and Israel have gone one by one, taking down countries, taking down governments, and nobody has stopped them. So it's kind of like, for me, in this very, like, I guess, childish way, I would like to see some pushback, but the reality is there isn't a coalition built to back Iran if they are being attacked from multiple fronts, if they are trying to cut them with these ISIS fighters, with the Kurds, with the Turks, with all of the mechanisms used by using the Gulf, everything that's been laid out in the plan. if that is being thrown at them and their allies aren't there to even say much other than we stand in support of Iran's sovereignty or some BS like that, I don't see that as enough. When with Donald Trump, he says no oil to Cuba, and nobody can seem to get oil to Cuba. Or when Donald Trump says no, we're going to put sanctions on Russia, nobody does anything. I mean, and again, I don't see the pushback from Russia either. The United States has continuously gone after them, has continuously violated red line after red line, and they haven't pushed back in the way. And we're getting into 4 years, actually today, if I'm not mistaken, it's 4 years of since the Russia-Ukraine war began. And, you know, when I arrived in Russia in 2022, it's been 4 years. People are tired of war. Like this is, and so it's like, we thought that Russia had said in the beginning, we're going to take down Ukraine very quickly. This isn't going to be a long time. People are saying this is longer than the Great Patriotic War. Like this is a longer war than that. And the economy is feeling it and all of this is happening. And yet we don't have a united front, which is what it's going to take to stop what is coming from the West and Israel. That's what it's going to take. And the reason we don't have that is because we're entering the era of less nation states and just these very much invested, heavily predator class interests. And I think people need to come to terms with, maybe we're not going to see, you know, this fight of the good versus the bad. I mean, we're in it, but we're not seeing what needs to happen. And I that's just, you know, my frustration with everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I certainly don't want to speak on behalf of the Iranian people. There's a lot of people doing that on social media and on YouTube, and that's not my place. And I know that you agree it's you know, it shouldn't be our place at all to do that. I do think if I simply analyze what's going on, there is a disparity, just as there is in Russia, actually, between the military sector and the Kremlin right now, because the statements that are coming out of the Kremlin are clearly not aligning with some of the military officials in Russia and so on. And I think in Iran, there is a similar disparity when you look at what Araghchi is saying, what Pezeshkian is saying, what the government are basically saying, and how effectively. I was talking with someone about this the other night, and it's almost like they're living in another era. They're living in an era of 10, 20 years ago where negotiations held some weight, where they're not dealing with an entire psychopathic block of power that has no interest in concessions, compromise, negotiations. They're just a trap. They're a device used to buy time, to lull negotiators into a sense of security. And effectively, in the end, they're destructive, because the more time that negotiations buy, the more time the enemy has to build up its proxy forces on the borders of Iran. And that's actually my greatest fear. I was talking to someone about the recent riots, someone from Iran, and they were saying the number of people that got pulled into the violence and the riots this time was far greater than back in 2022. So while it didn't succeed at that moment in time, the incremental pressure inside Iran is not going to go away, because the sanctions remain in place. And again, this was mirrored by what happened in Syria, 14 years of war, and then Trump brought in the Caesar sanctions in 2020. And everyone was kind of, we've lived under sanctions for years. It was a bit kind of laissez-faire about the whole thing. And I was like, no. These sanctions are completely different. And sure enough, they were. So I think my worry, frankly speaking, is that Iran or some elements within Iran think that if they can just keep up a war of attrition, keep the negotiations going, then the US is going to collapse internally. Israel is going to collapse internally, and then it's all going to go away. But if I look at it realistically, we are dealing with psychopaths. We're not dealing with pragmatic politicians or diplomats. I mean, it almost makes you kind of long for the era of, I don't know, even Bill Clinton. You know what I mean? Where you actually had some kind of realistic diplomacy going on. There's nothing now. It's non-existent. It's just bullying, intimidation, corporatocracy at work, and expansion at the expense of everything and anything that stands in their way, right? So I mean, I'm with you. No one wants a war. But the thing is that if Iran goes the route of, say, Venezuela, and thinks it can do a deal with the US and maintain its integrity and so on, but allow the US, and no, we're just, we're just going to go back to exactly what happened in Venezuela. And where does that leave the rest of the region? Like Yemen, Iraqi resistance, the remaining resistance in Syria and those that left Syria when it fell to the Takfiri forces. And excuse me, but what's going to happen to the potentially millions also of Takfiri that are being gathered inside Syria if they're not going to be used for a war against Iran? Where are they going to go, right? Because you've not only got the existing Takfiri inside Syria and the release of 20,000 plus ISIS members, you've also got the 300,000 that's been sent back from Lebanon, the prisoners, the Takfiri prisoners that have been released from Lebanese prisons, and more are under negotiation to be sent back to Syria. You've then got the EU talking about forced deportation of, 7 million Syrians that fled Syria during the conflict. Not all of them are going to be aligned with Jolani's ideology. Of course, I'm not saying that, but a percentage will be, whether that's 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%. It's a huge number that are potentially going to be sent back to Syria. So what happens to all of that? That's just a Takfiri cauldron. At some point, it's going to boil over. It's going to go into Turkey. It's going to come into Lebanon. It's going to go into Europe and eventually the United States. So in a sense, they're creating a situation, in my opinion, they have to do something with it. And if they can weaken and balkanize Iran in this way, then they can finish off what's left of the resistance in Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, because there's no support then from Iran. So I'm convinced that they're still going to go ahead with a project of destabilizing Iran. I just don't think it might be like tomorrow at dawn there's going to be a kinetic war. This is where I disagree. I think this is going to be, it's a long war. It's a long war of attrition against Iran. And we talked about China and Russia, and there's a lot of hyperbole on social media about how much Iran and China are coming to the help of Iran and so on. A lot of it is false. A lot of it is exaggeration. But we also need to remember that China, it's not dependent on buying cheaper oil from Iran, because it does get discounted prices because of the sanctions on Iran. Iran has limited export options for its oil, but it's going to have a knock-on effect economically on China if suddenly it's going to have to, because it's lost Venezuela, it's lost discounted oil from Venezuela pretty much. If potentially it's going to lose discounted oil from Iran, that's going to add a pretty big markup onto its profit margins. I'm not an economist either. So I think the impact is going to be substantial, not only on Iran, but also on China and even potentially on Russia, because Russia is actually dependent on the drone production from Iran. Like, everyone's talking about what Russia's sending Iran and how Iran can't cope without China and Russia. But the reality is that Iranian drones, technically speaking, are superior to Russian drones. And that's why Russia's been buying them, or not buying them because it hasn't paid for them, to use in Ukraine. So, it's an incredibly complex situation. I agree with you. I don't think China or Russia are going to kind of put their necks on the line if it does come to a kinetic war at all with Iran. But I have to also say the potential of Iran collapsing is catastrophic for this region.
Yeah.
Absolutely catastrophic, because then you enter the whole technocracy scenario. Yeah. And one last thing that I wanted to say, because you brought up Gaza and the bringing in of the whole surveillance sector in biometric measures and so on in Gaza. You're also looking at the increased appropriation of Palestinian lands in the West Bank. Like, there's potential now with the land in Area C, which is the majority of the land that's under the control of Israel. 83% of that is going to be lost through this state appropriation of land, which of course is not going to be sold back to Palestinians. It's going to be sold to the settlers, the squatters. And so West Bank is going to cease to exist in the same way as Gaza is going to cease to exist. So what I want to ask is, where does Russia and China stand on that then? Because their one defense of Palestine has been that there should be a two-state solution. But if there's no territory left for a two-state solution, where do Russia and China stand on that? Are they going to defend the very existence of Palestine? Or are they just going to go quiet, which is what they appear to be doing right now, because there's not a single mention of it. I mean, even the Gulf states have greater decency when they're offering the funding or the financing of the reconstruction of Gaza. They're saying, yes, but we're not going to give money while Israel is still committing genocide and is still destroying Gaza. Why would we fund anything until we have concrete guarantees that that is going to stop, that the Israeli forces are going to withdraw? Russia isn't saying that, nor is it defending the entire loss of the two-state. I don't even agree with the two-state solution, but it's becoming, it's going to be extinct even as a theory pretty soon if Israel continues on the track it's on. And Russia and China are doing absolutely nothing to prevent that, just as they did nothing really to prevent the genocide that escalated from October the 7th onwards.
God, I don't see how the United States and Israel will not, in one form or another, attack Iran, because they need Iran to fall in order to continue the expansion of Greater Israel. Without Iran falling, that can't happen. So one way or another, whether it's a war of attrition, whether it's a bombing campaign, whatever the case may be, I agree. I think that they're going to. The question is
biological.
Could be biological.
And Israel's threatening nuclear now. Both Netanyahu and one of the Knesset members was threatening nuclear today. So it could be false flag that leads to some kind of major nuclear strike. It could be biological weapons. I mean, they're already to some degree using that in Syria and in Lebanon, because they're spraying glyphosate on the agricultural lands in the south of Lebanon and in the south of Syria. So anything is actually possible, but that's my take on it.
And Israel's nuclear threats threaten the entire world. essentially.
Of course.
I think from is it Ecuador down, I think might be safe, but everybody else, I mean, it's crazy that we're having these conversations, but what I I guess what is dependent isn't only Iran's response, but the response of its allies. I mean, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Russia, because we have seen the very, very upfront declarations of Kirill Dmitriev on his affinity for Donald Trump and what the Trump administration is doing, calling him the president of peace, calling a lot of his cabinet members people of peace, even though they're anything but. We have seen the time and time again discussions about the war in Ukraine ending. And the thing is, like, I think up until a few weeks ago, I would say I think that's a strong possibility, as long as the Kremlin goes with that. And the Kremlin is, we're talking about Vladimir Putin, and we're talking about the fact that he has appointed Kirill Dmitriev as one of his top guys that is upfront talking about stuff. And again, in Russia, you don't really have somebody talk about things openly unless you want them to. So if he's allowed to do that, and there's of no consequence, and we're still seeing the same statements from Russia, that's fine. What we're also seeing, though, is now, as we mentioned earlier, the military wing has been even more vocal. They have been vocal for a long time that they want Russia to go after, to essentially not fold with the United States. They don't trust the United States. They say, why are you even working these deals? They're just like extending the time. They're making you waste time in order to distract you from actually just finishing off this situation in Ukraine. Now you have the military, and then you have the public. The public, as I said, is tired of the war. They're like, this is the fourth year of the war. There's a lot of inflation. There's a lot of things domestically going on that people aren't happy about. There's a lot of, Russia has banned essentially Telegram. It's getting hard to load videos and do any sorts of things on Telegram. WhatsApp doesn't work. A lot of the VPN stopped working until people come up with new ones. People aren't happy about that. And so you have this increasing dissatisfaction with somebody that people thought was impossible for others to be dissatisfied by, which is Putin. And there's been a lot of comments from a lot of Russian media channels, like Telegram channels and media analysts and military analysts, like Putin isn't really hitting hard enough. And then you have Sergei Lavrov. In some of the comments, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in particular him, have made about Donald Trump, which directly contradict any sort of affinity we have seen coming from the likes of Kirill Dmitriev. And like I've said this for a long time, Russia is not a monolith, and this isn't surprising to me, but I think a lot of people are having a hard time understanding what's going on in Russia, because they're like, wait, I thought, it was a done deal, that everything was agreed upon, and it's not the case. And I think there are people within Russia, from my understanding, that see what the United States is doing, and that see that they can't be trusted, and that are watching what's happened to all of these countries, and are kind of realizing, like, we are not, nobody is protected, I don't know what the phrase is, but there's not a golden cow, right? Like, everybody is a potential loser here. They could be next. And I think the realization is also happening on the background of how Iran's being threatened, how they're going after these countries one by one, and just moving in. Now, the problem is that we know that Putin does have a relationship with Israel. In particular, I say Putin, because it's not just Russia, it's in particular Putin.
No, it is particular.
Well.
Yeah.
And so that, as much as pragmatically even, it wouldn't benefit Russia to see Iran fall. There is that other aspect where they refuse to talk about the destruction of Israel. They have continuously said,
No,
we support the
they
two-state
wouldn't.
solution, right? And I think we support a two-state solution is we support the existence of Israel above.
Yeah,
even that.
We support an apartheid state, basically. That's what it comes down to. And we support the continued oppression and lack of agency of the Palestinian people. No justice, no reparations, nothing, basically. It continues with Israeli superiority in Palestine, effectively. That's what that is. And also we have to remember, look, in Syria, Russia gave the green light for Israel to target Iranian forces, Iranian ambassadors, or let's say diplomatic envoys, Hezbollah fighters, and had no problem with that throughout its presence from 2015 until 2024. It had no problem with that. It had a deconfliction agreement with Israel. It had forces on the border of the occupied Golan Territory to effectively hold back resistance from attacking the Golan Territory. So it had very much a role of defending the national security of Israel in Syria. Right. In Iran, we have to remember that Putin bailed on supplying air defense, just as he actually did in Syria, because when Netanyahu put pressure on him not to send the S-300s to Syria, he basically agreed in the sense that he sent a couple of S-300s, but the Syrian army personnel were never given training. They were never used in anger. And at the same time, in 2020, when Assad had the air defense treaty with Iran, and Iran was going to supply its air defense systems, which are kind of probably technically more advanced than the S-300, between the S-300 and the S-400, from what I understand. Russia effectively, I was speaking to someone today, and they said, no, Russia actually said, no, you're not bringing Iranian air defenses in. And at the same time, Putin reneged on the deal of sending S-300s to Iran when George Bush asked him not to, right? So Russia doesn't really have a great record under Putin of putting Iran first over Israel. Or even over the United States, to be honest. And even if we go back to kind of World War I, when Russia occupied northern Iran, and then even under the Soviet Union, they were funding and arming the separatists in northern Iran. Historically, Russia doesn't have a great relationship with Iran. And we're not talking a change of guard here, because a lot of this happened under Putin's leadership. And the close relationship between Putin and Chabad Lubavitch in Russia and Israel itself and Netanyahu himself, right, is undeniable. So, no, as regards Iran, they'll go so far, but they're not going to jeopardize relations with Israel, and they're certainly not going to jeopardize Israel's existence and even expansion. No.
And it's in essence, that translates to me as Israel above Palestine, above Iran, above, and people are going to have a hard time, I think, dealing with that fact, but it is a fact. I mean, you have millions of Russians living in Israel. You have a lot of them that enlisted to fight with the IDF, right? And
more than 5,000. They were number 3 in the list. I think first was US, then France, and then Russia, above Britain.
Insanity, above Britain, yeah. And so, I mean, and this isn't something that's welcomed by everybody at all, but this is a reality of the situation with Russia. Ultimately, I don't see a scenario where Russia fights back. The only reason we saw them go into Donbass was because at the moment they thought, okay, this is going to affect, they're going to take everything. And that I agree with that calculation, like that they had to. If they did it, it would have been complete and total, just the end of Russia as we know it. But now what they've done is they've extended this so long that they're in a position where if they don't negotiate in a way that is strong enough or looked on as strong enough, they're going to look weak. And if they don't negotiate and they try to get what they want and extend themselves, their economy is going to suffer. So either way, this is a losing battle because they don't have, you can't defeat the United States and NATO when they stick up for each other and nobody else does this on the other end. And when you are trying to constantly allow them to cross red lines, they know they can get away with it. So I don't really see a way for Russia to continue this war and get out of it alive. In fact, I think that that's what they thought they could do to kind of like just drag out the United States, kind of like what you said about Iran and people thinking that the United States will eventually be unable to back Ukraine and that NATO will eventually just be unable to do it. They're trying to drag it out. They're trying to continue going. But I think they have underestimated how much that has hurt them in the process. And a lot of these analysts, these pro-Russia, blah, that just literally just do propaganda all day, have completely underestimated the suffering of Russia, like on an economic level and on just like a people level, the civilian, the civilian consequences on a lot of things on life and stuff. Yes, there are no bombs being dropped in Moscow. People are living their lives normally. That is all true. But things have gone from, okay, we're not feeling it so much to like, now we're feeling it. And the thing is, there has to be a decision made. Either we're going to see the Kirill Dmitriev win out, which I have a feeling that that's the way it's going to go, because that's the way Putin is looking to. That's who Putin is looking to. Yeah. Or we're going to see this being dragged out longer, but eventually that's also not going to help Russia. So honestly, they are actually not in a good position, not in terms of military wins against Ukraine, because I do think that's a done deal. But that doesn't mean that they're winning in the sense of like against the West, because nobody's winning. Like look what's happening. They have continuously taken down country after country, people after people. They're capturing and they're taking, and they're not being stopped. And nobody's stopping them, and nobody's coming together and saying, hey, we need to do this. You know, the only people resisting are the actual resistance forces, but everybody else that is a powerful, entity, whether it's China, Russia, they're not, and they're not doing what needs to be done, which is like banding together and actually having some sort of plan to not budge. Which would be a possibility. And they're not doing that because they're not ideologically driven. They're driven by capital interests. And they know that things will be better off for them if they can just continue this global capitalist, continuity of economics. That's just where we're headed. And I honestly see this as a very dark time for humanity, because what happened in Gaza is happening again in Cuba, like in the sense of not blowing people up and that in the sense of just starving. Yeah. So we're going from here to here, and what's next, right? Like this is going to continue because it wasn't stopped, and it's still continuing in Gaza. So it's not stopped. So what else? If they can get away with that, they can get away with anything. So now you have to up the if you're going to oppose that. You can't just act like normal diplomacy is a possibility. You can't just act like you can just be isolate yourself to your own interests and here or there cooperate. Like that's not working. And BRICS is essentially just a farcical, dream of these people when you have India hailing Netanyahu. How can you have BRICS exist and talk about multipolarity, this and that, and the people coming up and all of this when you have Zionism embedded in BRICS? I might as well stand for Israel. It's just
Yeah, I mean,
I'm just
Modi is heading to Israel on Wednesday, and even as part of his speech, Netanyahu spent the whole paragraph talking about the partnership and alliance with India and how important it was, second only to the United States, and so on, right? And not forgetting also from China's perspective, and I wanted to read this because I think it was so chilling when I read it in Jerusalem Post about Israel's expansion into Taiwan, which of course directly challenges China to some degree, right? Although they have a very good relationship with China, China is heavily invested in Israel, despite everyone claiming to the contrary. But however, they're heavily invested in Taiwan. And there was just this one paragraph that I just read 2 or 3 times. So it says, what is the advantage of Taiwan? It's technological centrality with human capital as a strategic resource. Like, what? Seriously? Resilience cultivated across multiple dimensions. It's what joins Taiwan and Israel together. But this whole human capital as a strategic resource, I mean, we're heading into such a dark age with all of this, where literally that's what we are. We're human capital. We're another resource. Right? To basically feed into the technocratic machine. That's it. That's what we are. We're just fodder, whether it's for their wars, whether it's for their economic visions, whether it's for surveillance, whatever it is. That's what we are. And that's how we have to understand this. Because what is happening, as you said, country after country is falling or being destroyed. I mean, Lebanon is just being picked apart bit by bit. Every day there's another bombing, there's another assassination. Like the story of the one guy who'd gone to meet his wife's family, and he received a call from an Israeli number. And they said, okay, you can choose. You can die with your family or you can die alone. Make the choice. Right? This is the mentality. So he made the choice. He sent his family out. Then he realized it's not his own home. So it's awful. He brought the family back in. He got in his car, and like 30 seconds later, they hit with 2 drone missiles. This is the psychopathy that we're dealing with. This is not the mindset that is going to negotiate a win-win solution for Iran. This is the mindset that just as it imbued in the rioters to go out and dismember corpses, gouge people's eyes out, stab people multiple times, tear animals apart. I mean, I don't even know what that Jewish festival is in Israel where they throw pets on the bonfire. Which, it's true. I looked it up because I double checked it. And yeah, it's reported even in Hebrew media as being an issue. That's what you're dealing with. It's just satanic what they're doing. And that isn't going to be stopped by just having chats in Oman or making concessions or compromising. Never has been. Sorry, that was a rant.
No, I think, we're not doing well with our reputation of this doom and gloom that we have. But I honestly think they've gone from bad to worse. I honestly think like this has to be what the evil that we're facing, and it's nothing less than evil. Needs to be opposed with something major. You can't just fight them off, little wars here and there. Like there has to be some sort of unified global opposition to it. And that's what it's going to take, because right now, the way I'm looking at how things are going, it's really chaotic. It's really uncertain, unstable on so many planes, not just economically, but, mentally, psychologically. There's a lot of things happening that are taking a turn for the worse. I mean, we're seeing also, I don't know if you saw the release of these exposure that OpenAI and other AIs are basically feeding all of this information to the government, which should have been, you should have known that already. And, you know, any common sense would tell you that, but this is how they're able to capture people. And this is a global thing. I mean, we're talking about these companies that have access to everybody and anybody. And of course, the vast majority of these Silicon Valley companies have ties to Israeli spyware, which just tells you everything you need to know. So in essence, we're headed towards that digital age that is extremely technocratic, but it's now a digital type of technocracy, and very few countries are going to be opposing that. And the ones that are not going to be the major ones. We're seeing the drive even within Russia towards digital ID, China 100%, obviously the United States, the West, Europe, you know, like this, like the major countries that have this powerful tech are not running away from it. They're running towards it, and people are trying to, you know, glorify the advancement in robotics as like, oh, look how this robot is dancing, and it's Chinese robot, so it's okay. You know, once the robot has a bomb and a gigantic weapon aimed at you, we'll see how much you care whether it was a Chinese made robot or a US made one from Boston Dynamics. I mean, we're in the Black Mirror phase of, and we have been getting there, but the episodes are getting darker and darker.
Well, I know. I mean, it's, just look at the Chinese collaboration with UAE on technocratic tyranny. That's all you need to do, is just do a bit of research on the partnership between UAE and China, and remembering that UAE is just an extension of Zionism anyway. It has no independence. It works entirely as a proxy and a forward battering ram for the Zionist movement, pretty much everywhere, whether it's Africa, Cyprus, it doesn't matter. The UAE is there supporting Israel, and China is heavily embedded with it. It's number one trade partner in what's called the Middle East, but West Asia, right? So go and look at the partnerships and the collaborations there, and then you'll fully understand what China is involved in. And just as Israel is exporting its spyware, China is also exporting its surveillance expertise. It's giving states like the UAE the ability to crack down on dissidents and challenge anyone who is going against government policy. And all of this is coming into the UK, the EU, and the US. It's already there, actually. It's just people are not really waking up to the vast size of the complex that is now effectively feeding off your information, right? Not in a good way, in a predatory way.
Yeah. So, sorry guys, but the weather doesn't look so good. Unfortunately, I am seeing people kind of start to realize this on their own on social media. I'm seeing people push back on a lot of the things that we've been talking about. This isn't to toot our horn, because I wish we were wrong. I actually hope every day that there is like a strong fight coming from China, that there is like some sort of unity between the opposing side and going after Israel, and that there is some accountability. Every day I actually hope that happens. I really, really do, but I just don't see it in that way. I don't see it happening. I see this turn towards this neo-feudalism, with these very powerful people, and we're just cattle to them. And, we're data, we're labor, but that's it. And the only way to combat that is for everybody to be aware and start, making decisions to push it. And I always go back to, there's a lot of us and there are very few of them. So it really, really just takes a lot of deep thinking and organizing and action planning, not waiting for the next savior to come, which is what, we tend to do as a society. So that's as positive as it gets from me today.
Yeah, it's hard. Honestly, it's hard to retain positivity. When the daily grind of slaughter and oppression and tyranny, and just, I don't know, just darkness is just being rolled out. And really, if you stand in its way, you're just being crushed at the moment. And I guess that's where certainly everyone in this region is kind of, in not in a negative way, but they are literally pinning everything on Iran, because they know if Iran falls, or if Iran caves, or if Iran is just, their life source in a way. I'm not saying they're acting as proxies, but their life source as kind of the biggest country that represents resistance in the region, effectively, is in any way destabilized, destroyed. This region isn't going to survive very long in its current state. It's going to be Israelized very rapidly. Either Israeli or Takfiri, but I think even the Israelis don't want the Takfiri around long term. For them, it would be much happier to put them all in one place in a war against maybe Iran and then use nuclear weapons. That's, I'm just kind of like speculating now. That's not analysis by any stretch. But, this is their mentality. They don't care what happens to any of the people in this region, just that those that are left standing are aligned with Israeli policy and Washington's policy, because it's indivisible to a large degree, and are going to help them expand their sphere of influence economically as far as possible. That's it. But anyone is dispensable, even those perceived allies. They have no regard for them.
They don't have allies.
No, as Kissinger said. Anyway, so sorry, guys. There isn't an awful lot of positivity. There's just, I guess, again, we come back to, at least if you know what's going on, you can plan personally for it, or collectively to whatever extent you can.
Exactly.
Because we are the majority. And that is still a thing. We've seen it with the unions in Europe pushing back against the shipping of weapons to Israel. It is possible. It is possible to collectively push back, but it has to be collective. If you're isolated and individualized, just as they want you to be, then of course it's not going to happen.
Yep, exactly. Well, I think that's a good way to end it there, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in with us, and we'll see you next time with, hopefully, I don't know, more craziness, but also hopefully some light at the end. And thanks.
Yeah. Thanks. Take care.